Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for our webinar on why we love developmental evaluation. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my deepest respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Also like to acknowledge that in Australia, sovereignty has never been ceded and we're living on what is and always will be Aboriginal land. So for those who haven't attended a webinar with us before, or a course with us before, my name's Cam and I'm the head of the academy here at Clear Horizon. Clear Horizon is based in Naarm in Melbourne, Australia, and we're all about using measurement, evaluation and learning skills to support people creating positive impact in the world. And our academy translates that experience into really applicable and easy to access courses and learning opportunities, one of which is this webinar. But we also run a course on the topic of today's webinar, which is developmental evaluation. So today's session, if you've been to a webinar before, is going to run in a pretty familiar format, with one exception, that being that we're only going to run for 45 minutes. So there's a lot to pack in, and we'll do our best to fit everything that we can in there, including your questions as well. So for the first 15 minutes, I've got a few questions that we've prepared earlier, including some that have come through in the registrations already. And then we'll open up to some questions from you. So if you want to ask a question live, what you need to do is go down to the bottom panel and you'll see down there Q&A as an option. Click on that and then look through the questions. There may already be a question that has been asked that's similar to yours, and if so, just upvote that. And if not, type that question in there and we'll go with the questions that are up the top of the list, and then we'll work our way down in order of priority. So make sure you do some upvoting as well of questions that you really like. Also, there's the chat function down there next to the Q&A box. Please feel free to use that to interact with your panelists, more for just saying things like, oh, I don't quite understand that, can you clarify that a bit more? Or you're going too fast, can you slow down? Those kinds of things are good to pop in the chat there. And you can also talk to each other as well in there. We are recording the session, as you would have heard, and a video is going to be sent to you later on, so no need to take any notes there. And yeah, that's pretty much it of the boring housekeeping. Now we're off into the fun stuff. So joining me today, we have Kate McKegg, Kate Elliott, and Jamie Gamble. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all. I've had a webinar with Jamie and Kate about 6 months ago. It feels like yesterday. The past 6 months have flown by for me, but it's so great to have you back. So starting with Kate, Kate is an independent consultant and a pragmatic academic. I love that. She's also a founding member of the Aotearoa New Zealand Evaluation Association, co-founder of the Developmental Evaluation Institute, director of the Knowledge Institute, and a member of the Connect group. So no surprises there, Kate is very busy. Jamie is the founder and principal consultant at Imprint Consulting. He has extensive evaluation experience, having led over 50 developmental evaluations. And not only that, he's quite literally written a book on DE called A Developmental Evaluation Primer, and that was back in 2008. So Jamie's another groundbreaker here in this space. Welcome, Jamie. Kate Elliott, last but definitely not least, is an international developmental consultant, having worked across gender equity, social inclusion, and participatory approaches. And she's worked with a diverse range of clients and acronyms, including UNICEF, DFAT, and MFAT, and was an original member of or class member of our first course on developmental evaluation. Welcome back, Kate. It's so good to have you here. So let's start with our first question then. We know our audience has a pretty diverse range of experience in this topic area. We've got people who've potentially never heard of developmental evaluation until they saw the invite, right up to people who've done a few developmental evaluations themselves. So we'll try to do our best to speak to that broad range of experience. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be a good idea to kick off with a more introductory question. So maybe Kate, you could help us here. What is developmental evaluation exactly, and why do you think it's needed now more than ever?
Oh, I was just handing over to Jamie quietly in the chat, but that's all right. Yeah, so why is it needed more than ever? I guess we're living in these extremely turbulent, complex times, and just as we think we might be reaching some sort of new normal, it gets upended, and that changes in turbulence is with us all. And I guess more than ever, we need approaches to evaluation that can continually adapt, can continually be able to shift and pivot. And still be useful, and actually still be really useful, and that people can find they can use it. So I guess more than ever we need approaches to evaluation that don't lock us in quite linear ways of looking at the world, and imagining that somehow there's some stability there, because there just isn't. So I mean, that's what I would say is, and DE fits really nicely into that complexity. It is a form of evaluation for complexity. That's what it is. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Kate. Jamie, anything you wanted to add there?
Well, just that we hang on to what's great about evaluation, right? Being critical in our thinking, trying to overcome like biases in our thinking, trying to bring evidence and data and perspective. But classic evaluation was built around knowing everything up front and then testing if it played out the way you thought it would. And the kind of adaptation that Kate is talking about, just the world's not operating that way anymore. And we need that thinking, we need that data, we need that perspective to address the big challenges that we face. But we need to orient our evaluations suitably to respond to that.
Great. So it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater entirely. You're keeping that rigor that is so appreciated about traditional evaluation, but bringing it into the 21st century. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd add that rigor is more about how we think, the critical thinking that we use, and the way in which we account for different perspectives, the things that we notice, our reflective practice. So our rigor, the way in which we think about it, is also different. It's not throwing everything out, but it is reconceptualizing rigor as well, in this adaptive, complex space that we're working in. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification, Kate. And yeah, I guess speaking to what is different a bit more specifically, how is it different to other approaches exactly? I
can start. I mean, I think you often evaluations historically have been sort of like you do it at the end, like you're done the thing and now let's evaluate it, where we really bring evaluation in at the start, and we give it a front row seat to the change process. So the people that are working on whatever it is that's in development, you really marry the evaluation to their thinking, to their decisions, to their strategy. And whether that's someone who's part of like the organization, it can be somebody inside, or it can be someone out from the outside who's cast in that role, but they're really proximate to the action right from the outset.
Looks like we've lost Kate there. Hopefully she comes back to us. Yeah, I might hear from you, Kate Elliott, then. And sorry, I've been saying Kate. I should start saying Kate A and Kate M. I'll make sure I do that in future. Yeah, did you have any perspectives you wanted to share there, and how the approach to DE is different from stuff you've done in the past in the evaluation space?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was quite happy to take over Kate M's CV. I was fine with getting the acknowledgement for her work. That was all good. I suppose, like, to give some background to where I kind of joined the course from, I'd been a sort of quote unquote traditional evaluator for a while, and I was starting to find myself just really frustrated with how limiting the tools were and the perspectives were. And I was doing this work with different clients, and I could almost predict, you know, the answers that we would come up with at the end. And we were kind of failing to address some of the more complex challenges that were sitting there front and center. I mean, you know, there's lots of them, but examples like climate change or chronic racial inequality, or, you know, just these really meaty, you know, wicked problems, they're sometimes called. And I was just kind of pulling my hair out, because I felt I was just walking into a wall over and over again, because I just wasn't looking at the real challenges that were in front of us, instead focusing on the crumbs. So I kind of came with a slightly jaded attitude to the course, thinking like, oh gosh, I hope this really needs to like inspire me into a new way of thinking. And I really found that in this developmental evaluation approach. Like, I wouldn't say necessarily I've managed to employ it to its full capacity. Like, I see myself on a developmental evaluation like continuum. I'm working my way up, but already using the tools and the rigor of this kind of thinking to address complexity head on and make the most of kind of the relational components of being an evaluator. So not just pretending we sit in an academic tower and we're totally unbiased, but actually really acknowledging the human-centered components to evaluation. And lastly, I think that I found it really helpful is that developmental evaluation draws from many, many different fields. So I'd stayed in development for a long time, and I felt like an old fogey. You know, I'd seen the same sort of techniques used over and over again. And developmental evaluation pulls from, you know, ecology to mechanics to engineering to all these different ways of thinking about organizational change that just opened up like a curiosity and a whole new kind of world to explore.
Fantastic. What does it look like day to day on the ground for you? What's changed? What are you doing differently?
I think it's changed depending on the client and the context. I think we'll kind of go into this further, but obviously you can't use developmental evaluation at 100 volume all the time, based on different things like the clients and the context and the kind of work that you're doing. But for me, I've actually been surprised how quickly I've been able to embed some of the approaches that I've learned. Like, they're not as sort of terrifying as they initially seem to a traditional evaluator, right? So I've been able to bring in some of the sort of more adaptive components. So trying to step away from this like just traditional, like either formative or summative evaluation. You know, there's many more different kinds of gathering data and forming you know, conclusions that you can work in a more transparent and collaborative way with the clients and the donors and the people onto which the, you know, the program is happening to. So elevating some of the different voices that were always there but not heard in an academic sense.
Fantastic. Yeah, you mentioned what's your human-centered, which kind of, when you use that frame, reminds me of human-centered design and design thinking. Is there much overlap with that area?
Well, that I'm throwing over to the other two experts in here. I'm going to quietly duck out of that point.
Sure. And welcome back, Kate M.
Sorry about that. This is living in the country.
Not a problem at all.
So, Jamie, similarities with co-design?
Human-centered design.
Oh yeah, they're cousins for sure. Like I think human-centered design processes like labs, as an example, tend to employ developmental evaluation, often because there is prototyping going on, and so you're testing something out in the real world, and you want feedback on that prototype. So that is a very sort of developmental evaluation kind of thing. And I think a lot of the systems thinking that underpins human-centered design is certainly very much there in developmental evaluation. You know, I think they are distinct in that, like, design is its purpose is to create something new, right? And developmental evaluation, its purpose is to assist the thinking of those doing the doing, right? And so they certainly walk in parallel, but are distinct also in some ways.
Great. Anything you wanted to add there, Kate M?
No, I think Jamie's nailed it. I mean, I think there's plenty of situations. I think that they are cousins who don't always know how to get on with each other because they have different demands and they come from different places. But I think we're increasingly learning how to get on with each other. So yeah, so we're developing deeper relationships as cousins. And yeah, so that would be the only thing that I would add to what Jamie had to say.
Great. All right, now we know our learners love to hear really practical, tangible examples of this stuff because it can be a bit esoteric for some people. So I might start with you, Kate M. Is there a case study you wanted to share with us today?
Yeah, thanks, Cam. Look, I thought I might share my most recent large gnarly DE that has just kind of is just winding up actually as we speak, and I'll quickly outline why it's large and gnarly. Is with a government agency. For those of you that work in government, DE does happen there too, and it started off as it started off as an initiative to try and co-design with communities, to have locally led co-design processes around developing a more intensive form of support for young people and their families who were in touch with the care system. So they had come to the notice of the care system, but what they were trying to prevent was them having to enter the care system. And I guess one of the things so the early conceptions have been designed, the early kind of policy papers and cabinet papers were very much top down, developed in national office, but with strong sentiments of locally led and family-centered kind of ways of working. And they wanted DE alongside that because it was developing something new, a new kind of approach. What's come out of over 2.5 years of DE and learning in that process, it was highly complex DE at multiple levels. So we're talking about relationships at multiple levels: national, regional, local, relationships at local levels between local offices and locations, and iwi or tribes, Māori organisations, community organisations having to develop relationships at those levels, as well as within the organisation itself, the big government agency. So they had those multiple layers of relational stuff going on. And I guess DE sat alongside this initiative in some of these locations. We had developmental evaluators who worked at the local level and also at the national level. And we all had to coordinate and work with each other as this thing rolled out and as it started to learn as it went. And I guess what's come out is rather than a co-design process, although there was one out of all the locations, there was one formal co-design process that got underway. What's actually emerged is a series of principles for partnering with tribes, with Māori tribes, with iwi, a series of principles for partnering, and also some preconditions for what needs to be in the authorising environment for these things to get off the ground, for it to be really locally led, for it really to be whānau-centred or family-centred kind of practice. And the DE has led that development. The evaluators have fed back locally, and then we've synthesised things up at national office. But one of the distinctive features of this DE has been that we've worked really hard at maintaining a very locally led perspective throughout this, because the uniqueness of each situation was so different. The local histories were so different. Their colonisation histories were different. So we had very, very different histories and types of relationships to have to navigate. Be the gnarly one that's just winding up, and we're just in this process of developing those principles of practice up for sharing more widely. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. Jamie, we'd love to hear one from you too.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a very Canadian one, and I think there's probably a few folks joining from Canada today. That's where I'm based. I know many of you are far, far away, but if you think about Canada, I often think about hockey. And I just put in a link to this initiative. It's called the Future of Hockey Lab, and it's a province-wide prototype. It's happening in one of our smaller provinces called Nova Scotia, being led by the provincial association there. But you know, if you follow the news in Canada, there's been certainly incidents of racism coming to the forefront within hockey. It is a normative kind of Canadian space, right? There's a lot of Canadian identity wrapped up into it, but there's also a lot of a lot of the underlying issues about access in sport and inclusion and equity in sport really manifest very, very strongly in hockey. And so the lab is really about, like, how do we support the kind of cultural evolution within this sport to make it accessible, available, an inviting space for everybody? And so the lab is really experimenting with, like, what are the policy shifts? What are the culture shifts? What are the sort of some of the new programs and initiatives that might help with that? And so the DE is supporting on 3 levels. One you've got a bunch of people who are really revved up who want to try stuff on the ground. You know, you've got people trying to change how ice time is allocated in, you know, community rinks. You've got people, one group's they're partnering with a local mosque to create a entry to hockey program for the Muslim community in one of our cities. They're testing stuff out. And so the DE for them is kind of in a scientist mode, like, what happens when you try something out? Do some of our assumptions play out? You know, was that a good idea? Was that a bad idea? What's the next step in this thing that we are prototyping? But at the same time, there's a DE for the team that is designing and holding the space for the whole initiative. What's unfolding in front of us as we lay out this program? What's working and what's not working? What's missing? What needs to be added to the agenda in the larger arc of the program? And then there's a third level, which is there's some intention around, can this actually be a leverage point for change in the whole sport system? You know, and that's a long-term aspiration. But what are we learning about the leverage points for actually really sort of substantive and fundamental change within large institutions, within, you know, policies and practices, and harvesting what's being learned from some of these smaller initiatives and observations within the system to formulate the strategy for going at that bigger shift. And ultimately, the hope is that this will scale into other provinces and maybe even become a national initiative, like it's happening in a very small way right now. But the DE is feeding into that thinking. And so, you know, and it started like well before the first group got together to start to work on this. Like, you know, it was just a couple people in a room really starting to think about this idea when the DE has started, and now we're, you know, almost a year into it being implemented, and that really, I think, helped sort of position the DE to really be a good support to, you know, the questions, the uncertainties, the decisions that they were trying to wrestling with as an initiative.
That's exciting. The potential for change, or for sport as a vehicle for social change, is huge.
Yeah.
I know it's really early days, but are you seeing any impact as a result of the DE work at this point?
I think it's too early. Like, I think a lot of, like, you know, people struggle with prototyping. Like, we went through a lot of, you know, just getting people up to speed on what that might look like. And so a lot of those are just hitting the ground within the last 2 months. I would say if you ask me at the end of April, I think we're going to start to see some things really starting to happen, but it's just starting to get active right now. So it's just a little bit too early to see anything on the ground.
Sounds like you might have some examples to share in the course, though, down the road.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.
Awesome. Kate A, how about you? What's an example from your work where you've been applying this approach?
Yeah, I guess I'd still caveat it with, like, I feel like a student that's been caught out for not doing their homework, but I only finished the course about 4 months ago, so just, like, bear with me.
It's very new.
I've got my training wheels on, yeah. But I suppose just to give a counterbalance to KM's and Jamie's examples, like, I remember when we were doing the course, and there's these fantastic examples they can bring of these, like, incredibly innovative approaches to these long-standing entrenched problems. And I remember I was like, look, the clients that I work for just don't have much appetite for risk. So how am I meant to employ some of these approaches if they're not going to take this sort of tech startup, you know, fail fast, fail early kind of approach to some of these initiatives? And Jamie and Kate gave me really good advice in that they were like, you can kind of Trojan horse some of DE into traditional approaches, and you can sell it on different components, and it doesn't have to be the whole kit and caboodle in order for it to be the DE approach. So something that I've been doing I'm working on a design for a long-standing Australian kind of community development program in PNG at the moment. And this particular program, I'm being purposefully vague, has been a long-standing piece of the Australian aid, you know, principle. There was no question about, you know, it not being run again. But the real question for me was, well, how do we make sure that even though it's going to roll out in a similar mechanism, how can we do better to build in learning from the program itself? And how can we conceptualize it to move in a slightly different angle, even though we don't hold all the cards? So there was two things that I really took away from the course that helped me do that. Like, one was this real emphasis that the evaluator doesn't have to just remain the academic hat, right? You can be the sort of educator, the facilitator. You can just be quite transparent about the different tools that you have in your toolkit, and you can bring that to the client, to the funders, to the communities, and bring all the pieces together rather than just sitting there in your university, you know, OECD report center, which I think would be fair to say there has been times I've played that role. So that I really tried to bring in, and that yielded much, much better results than I had anticipated. And the other thing I did, which echoes what KM said, was really trying to elevate community-owned principles and have that as a grounding piece for both the design and the ways in which the evaluations were conducted in the future. So we brought in a number of PNG experts that really became big pieces of the thinking, and brought and taught us, the rest of the international kind of contributors, about different principles of PNG culture, like Luksave, and different ideas about knowledge and ways of hearing. And so that really helped, although it didn't necessarily to the funder seem like a huge risk and a major change, it really grounded the principles and really centered the design in a way that I hope will be much more robust going forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kate. Our next question here, we've got, what needs to change at the individual practitioner and organizational levels to successfully introduce DE? And maybe Kate A, did you want to go there?
Sorry, I just got two messages at the same time and my brain got distracted.
Right.
Do you mind repeating that question?
Or we might throw to Kate M if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what needs to change as an evaluator, and I'm sorry everybody for dropping in and out. Now I'm on my phone because honestly, truly, the internet is, we had a cyclone here a week ago, and things just haven't really quite picked up the way they should have. Yeah, so as an evaluator, I think many evaluators that I know, when DE first appeared on the scene, they were relieved to finally have a name for something that they'd actually been doing for quite a long time. And that was that kind of working alongside communities, working alongside initiatives as they were getting started, and not really knowing what to call that work that they were already doing. And so DE gave a name to this kind of thing. On the other hand, as evaluators, if we're trained, as evaluators, then we get used to thinking that we need a theory of change, we need to have a good plan, and we need a timeline, and everything's set, and our plan's going to cover the whole evaluation. So I guess one of the things is moving out of the comfort of those things that we find really helpful to kind of plan our projects, that project planning kind of mentality, into a place where quite often things aren't like that. It's quite uncertain, and we're having to constantly redesign, redevelop, adapt, including budgets. And I saw that there's a question about budget. So that's one of the things that does also have to shift. That you don't necessarily know what you don't know when you start something, especially if it is just developing and emerging, and that you might have to shift the way in which you plan your budget cycles as well. In the organisation, I think one of the biggest learnings I've had for doing DE, and it's come out of this latest one as well, is what I call the authorising environment around how to work differently, how to learn, and how to change, be able to be responsive. And a lot of organisations just don't have that authorising. They have very tight commissioning guidelines or procurement guidelines, and they have rules around the kinds of reporting that you might need to do. So that authorising environment for this kind of way of working can change. We have been able to work with this organisation, this large government organisation, and create some changes, even to procurement and commissioning as we've gone, because that's been one of the real barriers to this way of working. So that's what I would say, is that there are some of those big things, but there's also just that authorising environment. Are you ready to have you got people in your environment and structures and systems that will allow people to be responsive and adaptive and transparent as they go? Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Jamie, anything you'd like to add there?
Well, it's just like look in the mirror. Is there really something in development here? Like, are we really radically trying to do something different that hasn't been done before? Are we really sort of staring at some kind of complexity where we've got a lot of uncertainty and the path forward could be this, 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 or this? Because if you don't have that, like, I think DE might be more of an investment than what you actually need, or it might be more cumbersome than what you actually need. And that is totally fine. And so, like, you know, have that sort of existential moment to say, yeah, we're really actually driving off the map here. And it's worth it to put some of our resources to learning quickly to help us find our way. Because you're going to naturally figure out a bunch of stuff, right? Like you will find your way eventually, but is it worth it to resource figuring that out sort of better and faster? And I think, you know, because I think that gets at some of the budget questions that are popping up in the Q&A as well. Like I really like the question, like, you know, if you have a limited budget and there's one fundamental component, like that is very DE to say, like, actually, let's put all our evaluation resources into the one piece where we've got a lot of uncertainty. Great, right? And let's just let the other stuff go for a while. It lets you probably succeed more in that space. It also lets you sort of build the muscle of doing this work, and then you can expand it or shift it over time.
Kate, is there anything you wanted to add there at this stage? Sorry, Kate A.
Gonna get ourselves confused. I would say sort of more at a personal level, I've found what I need to bring to the job, like a lot of curiosity, and I can't just like rely on just traditional ways that I've done my work in the past. So that sounds quite lazy, but you know, like you've really got to come up with creative ways of thinking. And I also think a sort of willingness to accept, you know, when you're wrong or when it hasn't worked. Like so often, I mean, I've been a consultant for a while, so I think it's fair to say that, you know, consultants can like come up with all these whiz bang words and are constantly on a PR warpath to try and seem like they're bright and wonderful. And I think DE forces us also to, like, you know, constantly be pivoting and assessing, you know, is my great new fandangled idea actually working? And if not, what are we going to do to change it? So kind of constantly thinking about that way and hearing from different people about, you know, is this actually hitting the mark?
Fantastic. So some pretty great mindset shifts that have to happen there. When shouldn't you bother? I mean, we mentioned readiness, and that's one aspect of it. Maybe we could talk a bit more about that, but more broadly, like, when is this not a suitable approach? I'm happy for anyone to take the lead here.
Well, I'll start, and Kate can add. But you know, I think we've covered like two of the three, right? Like, is it a developmental situation? Like, is there something going on that's being developed, right? And then, like, Kate M was just like, are you ready to adapt, right? Like, are you actually going to sort of absorb this learning and let it change what you're doing? And the one I would add is, like, are you, like, do you have a readiness to evaluate, right? Do you have sort of some capacity within your system to learn, to go out and ask questions? And when you get feedback that you don't like, are you going to listen to it, right? Because sometimes, like, it's telling you things that aren't pointing you in the direction that you hope it should go. Like, you're getting stuff that challenges some of your assumptions. Are you ready for that? You know, and I think if you've got somewhat of all those three, and I haven't met anyone yet who has all three, like, you know, we're all working on developing those. But if you're like really low on all three of those, it might be a real struggle to do DE. You might just be fighting it more than actually benefiting from it.
Great. Kate M, anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, and I guess the only other thing I mean, in the course, you get introduced to some tools for how you might assess readiness, and the tools can be very helpful. And we've found that they don't have to be given to the organization like a standard tool, and everyone, you can use it as a way of opening up conversations about readiness. These tools, they're useful openers for that conversation, but they're also recognizing that level of readiness shifts and changes over time. There's nothing like a complete restructure in an organization or the kind of turnover of staff to really shift that readiness. So you do have to be prepared for changes. And, you know, a change in chief executive can happen in some of these organizations, and suddenly the whole tone of the organization, the culture in the organization starts to jiggle a bit. And I guess that's just something else that you have to be mindful of around readiness. It's not a fixed state.
Excellent. All right, so we're now into the audience questions. There's a couple we've received before through the registration process. Any reflections on how to do pilot approaches for programs is the first one we've got here. Who'd like to take that?
I think if you're piloting a program, you're probably past DE, right? Like, to me, a pilot is actually a very well-developed, well thought out, maybe not mature, but like you've worked out all the bugs, and now you're trying to make a case for it to be scaled. You're working out some of the implementation issues. But I think if you're at piloting, you're actually past DE, and you probably want to look to more just standard evaluation approaches.
Great. And what are the most significant pitfalls in using this approach that might jeopardize its effectiveness?
Honestly, truly, I think it boils down to the nature of the relationships you have in one of these. Is that DE is highly relational because as an evaluator, you are the one working and working very closely with your client or with whoever it is that you're working in, and those on the ground. And the nature of those relationships can really upend DE depending on what's going on, or they can really push it forward. There are lots of things that can upend DE, but that would be one of the key ones for me. This is a relational practice that relies on us continually honing and those skills of noticing and building trust and our practices to be able to be that trusted advisor. So and you can lose that trust in an instant by not being authentic and transparent. So yeah, I would say that would be. Jamie, something to add?
No, I think you've covered. There's lots of questions, so let's kind of through those.
Let's move through. We've got just under 10 minutes, so a bit of time left. How to make the evaluation or developmental evaluation robust using quality assurance principles, and this one comes from Michelle.
Maybe we'll just tag team Kate. I mean, I think quality assurance and DE have some overlap. Like, you know, in quality assurance, you are being sort of rigorous in your thought process. You are testing something. It tends to be, in my experience, like, but they're quite different. Like, you know, to me, you know, quality assurance is really about sort of improving processes. Where I think DE, everything is on the table. Like, there's a sort of much more sort of radical innovation space sort of development underway when you're doing DE. So, I mean, I think if you've got good quality assurance approaches, great. Like, draw on those. Those will give you some sort of methodological chops that may fit into a DE. But I wouldn't assume just because you can do quality assurance, everything just migrates over and it's the same thing. Because I think they actually serve fundamentally different purposes.
Okay. So how would you say DE is different or the same as participatory action research? Kate, how about you?
It's me, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a question that comes up quite a lot, and I would say that they're cousins as well. They're close cousins, and participatory action research has those cycles of learning and action built into them, and DE does draw on many of the learnings from participatory action research. So DE is this kind of grab bag, and this kind of it's drawn on a range of traditions and disciplines to come together into this approach to evaluation. But I think one of the things that differs is the word evaluation. So action research, whilst it is also participatory action research is about action, often it's focused on solving a problem of some kind. So it has a problem-solving element in it, whereas evaluation is about is that thing in the middle, that word called value. So it's about determining the path, how valuable something is or not as we go, and building that in with evidence, bringing evidence to the table and making those crucial decisions around the value or worth or importance of something, and being really, really critical about why we're choosing those boundaries. Why are we choosing to call this more valuable than that? And that's what makes evaluation different to some forms of research, actually, even though those things may well go on inside a participatory action research project, because I know they do. But you're much more intentional about those value positions and the exploring of value, importance, and worth. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kate.
Right. Just one thing. Everything Kate said, yes. And I tend to think of participatory action research as a methodological choice, right? Like, and where DE is sort of a purpose choice. You could do participatory research on a summative evaluation or a formative evaluation or a developmental evaluation. And so absolutely cousins, but a little bit of apples and oranges.
This one, I think I'll throw to you, Kate A. How do you get buy-in and authorization in your organization to do this approach? How did you go about that?
I look forward to getting some. I can't wait. No. I mean, as I mentioned before, like I'm still in the processes of bringing some of my clients along to this, but I must say, I think you can't discount your perceived appetite for their risk might actually be incorrect. I think I came away from the course thinking that I would never get buy-in from some of my clients to do these kinds of things because they would see it as too risky. And actually, there's some that I was just wrong. So, you know, although for us as evaluators, you can see things as really fundamentally different to the way you might do a summative or a formative, you know, to perhaps a non-evaluator, it's not really as groundbreaking as you might think. So I think if you have really good relationships, like KM was saying, you just trust each other to, you know, work towards the aim together. So, and I've been just selective about the ways in which you introduce different components. You don't necessarily go straight to like, let's try to fail, you know, you sort of spoon feed it up. And I hope to work on like bigger and, you know, more innovative, like, you know, crazy funding schemes. But for now, I'm sort of gradually building my toolkit, building the confidence in having this sort of different approach. And yeah, so far people have been really receptive to that.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. We've probably got time for one more question here, and this one's from Lisa Hill. How would you go about incorporating developmental evaluation in a global program and, you know, address the cultural and context of elements? And that's open to anyone, really.
Look, I would recommend that she checks out Michael Quinn-Patton's work in this regard, because he's doing DE globally across large you know, international borders, and he's kind of moved into he's moving into transformational evaluation, and he's got you know, a global initiative underway. So I would really recommend going there. I've never really worked at a global level, so I don't feel able to speak directly from my own experience, but he would be the person that I would look up in terms of his new.
Oh, we lost Kate there, it looks like. Oh, she's back.
So it's back. The thing to look up is blue marble evaluation. If you Google that, you would find out a lot of what Kate's referring to.
Thanks, Jamie. That's what I was racking my brain as I was talking. It's called something marble, but I can't remember.
Can I also throw in there as well? There is, I mean, it's starting to really elevate, but I've heard a lot of the German aid organization GIZ starting to look at this kind of stuff. They're looking broadly across their aid program, and also USAID, like USAID, are thinking about this as well. And a number of the UN agencies, like UNICEF in particular, are also looking at that question. So I'm not sure if they have all the answers, but they might be places to look for them.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Kate. Well, we are out of time. I'm hugely grateful for our three panelists today, Jamie Gamble, Kate Elliott, and Kate McKeag. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your hard-earned wisdom with all of us. We will be sending out an email after this with the video of the recording, and we'll also include there information about the course so you can go in and access more information about learning with us and learning this approach in the Academy. I'll just drop it in the chat actually. Here's the link to the course. And if you type in webinar 15 at the checkout, I'll drop that in the chat as well, you'll get 15% off as a participant of this webinar. So that's there and available. And if not, we'll see you at another webinar soon. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hopefully see you down the road. Bye everyone.